Story number 1. The Vanishing of Skymaster 375. The Alaskan wilderness doesn't give up its secrets easily. It's a place of endless cold, where the mountains seem to stretch forever and the sky feels impossibly vast. I grew up hearing stories about the Triangle, that cursed expanse of land where planes vanished without a trace and hunters never returned. Most people chalked it up to bad weather, pilot error, or mechanical failure. I believed that, too, until I joined the search for Skymaster 375. It was January 1950, and I was a young airman stationed at Elmendorf Air Force Base. When the call came in about the missing C-54, I didn't think much of it at first. Planes got lost all the time up here. The terrain and weather were unforgiving. But as the hours stretched into days, the mood on the base changed. Skymaster 375 wasn't just late. It was gone. The plane had been carrying 44 people, mostly military personnel, on a routine flight from Anchorage to Montana. It had taken off without incident and was last heard from over the Yukon Territory. Then, nothing. No distress signal. No wreckage. Just silence. The Air Force launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in history. Dozens of planes combed the wilderness, while teams on the ground battled snow and sub-zero temperatures. I was assigned to one of those ground teams, tasked with scouring the dense forests near Kluane National Park. We didn't find anything, not a scrap of metal, not a single footprint in the snow. It was as if the plane had simply vanished into thin air. On the 6th day of the search, our team set up camp near a frozen lake. The forest around us was dense, the trees skeletal and coated in frost. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot. We were exhausted, our spirits frayed by the relentless cold and the gnawing sense of futility. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, a low hum, rhythmic and unnatural. At first, I thought it was one of the generators, but the noise seemed to come from the woods. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground. The snow seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, and I felt a strange pull, like something was calling me. "Do you hear that?" A voice said behind me. It was Carter, one of the other airmen. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the forest erupted in light. It wasn't a normal light. It wasn't the beam of a searchlight or the glow of a flare. It was otherworldly, shifting colors that danced across the trees, casting long, flickering shadows. For a moment, it felt as though the entire forest was alive, breathing with the light. And then we saw them. Figures moved between the trees, silhouetted against the glow. They were tall and thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching us, their presence heavy and oppressive. Carter swore under his breath, his hand going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "What the hell are those?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The figures grew closer, their forms becoming clearer. They weren't human, at least, not entirely. Their skin shimmered like the light, and their eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in everything around them. They moved with an eerie grace, their long limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One of them stopped a few yards away, tilting its head as if studying us. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was inside my head, a series of fragmented thoughts and emotions that didn't belong to me. Images flashed before my eyes. A plane in free fall, the faces of terrified passengers, a blinding light swallowing everything. And then, silence. I don't remember getting back to the tent. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and the light was gone. Carter was sitting by the fire, his hands trembling as he stared into the flames. "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked. He didn't answer. When we rejoined the main search party, no one believed us. They chalked it up to stress, sleep deprivation, and the tricks the mind plays in the wilderness. But Carter and I knew what we'd seen, and we weren't alone. Other teams started reporting strange occurrences: lights in the sky, voices in the wind, equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason. One pilot swore he saw a ghostly plane flying parallel to his, its windows dark and empty. Another team found footprints in the snow, too large and too deep to be human, leading nowhere. The search was called off after 3 weeks. Officially, the Air Force declared the plane lost, its crew presumed dead. But unofficially, the stories persisted. Years later, I returned to Alaska, unable to shake the memory of that night. I spoke to locals, hunters, and bush pilots, collecting their stories. They all described the same thing: the lights, the figures, the sense of something vast and unknowable watching from the shadows. Some believed it was the spirits of the land, angry at the intrusion. Others spoke of portals, places where the fabric of reality thinned and let other things through. But no one had an answer that made sense. One old Tlingit woman put it best: "The mountain takes what it wants," she said, her voice trembling, "and it doesn't always give it back." I still dream about the Skymaster. In my dreams, is trapped in that light, suspended between worlds, his passengers frozen in time. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum again, soft, insistent, pulling me back to the forest, back to the shadows. Story number 2. The lights over the triangle. Alaska's wilderness is as haunting as it is beautiful. It's a place where the sky feels too big, the land too quiet, and the nights stretch on forever. My friends and I went there for an adventure, a camping trip deep in the heart of the Alaska Triangle. What we found was something else entirely. It was June 2004, the kind of summer that makes you forget winter even exists. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Alyssa, and my younger brother, Evan. Jake had read about the Alaska Triangle and convinced us it was the perfect spot for our annual camping trip. I wasn't so sure. The stories about missing planes, vanishing hikers, and strange lights didn't sit well with me. But Jake laughed it off. "Come on," he said. "We'll have a good story to tell." He wasn't wrong about that. We drove for hours, leaving Anchorage far behind. The highway gave way to dirt roads, and eventually, we were driving through nothing but trees and open sky. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the land. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It was perfect, too perfect. The first night was uneventful. We set up our tents, cooked over a fire, and talked late into the night. Evan, always the skeptic, brought up the stories about the triangle. "They're just myths," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "People get lost out here all the time. It's not supernatural." Jake grinned. "What about the lights?" Evan shrugged. "Aurora borealis, probably, or some military experiment." Alyssa shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Whatever it is, I don't want to see it." I didn't say anything. I'd grown up hearing about the triangle, about the lights that appeared out of nowhere and the people who disappeared without a trace. But sitting there by the fire, surrounded by friends, it was hard to feel scared. The wilderness felt vast and indifferent, but not threatening. That changed the next night. It started just after sunset. We were sitting around the fire again, talking and laughing, when Alyssa pointed to the sky. "Look," she said, her voice tight with unease. We followed her gaze and saw it, a bright green light, swirling in the sky like liquid fire. At first, I thought it was the aurora, but it moved too fast, darting back and forth in patterns that no natural phenomenon could make. "What the hell is that?" Jake muttered, standing up. The light grew brighter, pulsing with an eerie rhythm that made my skin crawl. It felt alive, intelligent, as if it was watching us. And then, without warning, it shot toward the ground. The light stopped a few hundred feet away, hovering above the trees. The air grew heavy, electric, and the fire flickered as if struggling to stay lit. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of me. "We need to leave," Alyssa said, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the light exploded outward, engulfing the campsite in a blinding flash. I felt myself falling, my body weightless, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, it was daylight. The fire was out, the campsite eerily quiet. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt like lead. I sat up slowly, looking around for the others. Jake was lying a few feet away, his face pale and drawn. Alyssa and Evan were still in their tents, motionless. For one terrifying moment, I thought they were dead. But then Jake groaned, stirring. "What happened?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. Alyssa and Evan woke a few minutes later, both of them dazed and disoriented. Alyssa's hands were shaking, and Evan kept rubbing his temples like he was trying to piece something together. "The light," Alyssa said. "Do you remember the light?" We all did, but what came after was a blank. Ours were missing, and none of us could explain why. We packed up and left that morning, driving in silence. The forest, once so inviting, now felt oppressive, the shadows too deep and the silence too complete. I kept glancing at the sky, half expecting the green light to return. It wasn't until we got back to Anchorage that we noticed the marks. Jake was the first to find a series of small, circular scars on the back of his neck. They were perfectly spaced, like they'd been made with a machine. Alyssa had similar marks on her wrist, and Evan found his on his ankle. I had them too, a line of faint indentations running along my spine. We didn't know what to make of them. They didn't hurt, but they felt wrong, like they didn't belong. Jake wanted to see a doctor, but Alyssa refused. "What if they ask questions?" she said. "What if they don't believe us?" We never went to the doctor. Instead, we tried to move on, to pretend the trip hadn't happened. But the marks were only the beginning. The dreams started a few weeks later. They weren't dreams exactly, they felt too real, too vivid. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sensation of cold metal against my skin. In the dreams, I was lying on a table, surrounded by shadows that moved like the green light. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel them watching me, probing my mind, my memories. Jake called me one night, his voice shaking. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The hum." I hadn't noticed it before, but after Jake mentioned it, I couldn't unhear it. A low, constant vibration at the edge of my perception, like the distant thrum of a machine, followed me everywhere, growing louder in the silence. It's been nearly 20 years since that trip, but I've never been the same. None of us have. Jake moved to the city, avoiding the wilderness at all costs. Alyssa stopped answering calls, retreating into herself. Evan disappeared last year. No one knows where he went, but I have my suspicions. The marks are still there, faded but visible. The dreams still come, and the hum never stops. Sometimes, I think about the light, about the moment it descended and took something from us, something we'll never get back. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a flicker of green in the sky, and I know it's not over. Story number 3. The Shadows of Denali. Denali is a place of legends, towering above the Alaskan wilderness. It's as beautiful as it is brutal, a magnet for climbers and adventurers seeking to conquer its icy slopes. But for every triumph, there are whispers of those who never made it back. Stories of vanished expeditions, strange lights, and things in the snow that can't be explained. I didn't believe any of it until the mountain took my friends. In the summer of 1990, I joined a climbing team led by my best friend, Ryan. He was one of the best mountaineers I'd ever known, confident, experienced, and fearless. There were 5 of us in total: me, Ryan, his girlfriend Emily, and two seasoned climbers, Mark and Tom. We were chasing a dream, to reach the summit of Denali and stand where few had stood before. The climb started well enough. The weather was clear, the air crisp, and spirits high. We made steady progress, camping at higher elevations each night, our gear laden with everything we'd need for the final push. The nights were cold, but we huddled in our tents, swapping stories and laughing until sleep claimed us. By the fourth day, the weather turned. It started with a strange stillness, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and a faint hum seemed to vibrate through the ice. Mark noticed it first, pausing mid-step to tilt his head like he was listening to something. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We all stopped, but the hum faded as quickly as it had come. Ryan dismissed it as wind, and we pressed on, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The mountain felt different, like it was watching us. That night, the storm hit, came out of nowhere, a howling blizzard that battered our tents and obliterated the trail. We huddled together, the wind screaming outside, and tried to wait it out. But the storm didn't stop. Hours turned into a day, then two, and the snow piled up around us, burying our camp. On the third night, the whispers started. First, I thought it was the wind, a faint murmur that ebbed and flowed with the gusts. But then I heard my name. "Alex!" It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. I sat up, my breath clouding in the freezing air, and looked around the tent. Ryan and Emily were asleep, their faces pale and drawn. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Alex, come outside." I unzipped the tent and stepped into the storm, my flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. The wind bit at my face, but the voice was clear now, leading me away from camp. "Alex!" This way. The footprints stopped me in my tracks. They were fresh, leading away from the tents and into the darkness. But they weren't normal. They were too large, too deep, and they weren't human. The tracks had long, claw-like impressions, as if something massive had passed through. I stumbled back toward the tent, my heart racing. Ryan was awake now, his face pale as he zipped up his coat. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, the storm had subsided, leaving a surreal silence in its wake. We emerged from our tents to find the world buried in snow. The trail wiped clean, but the tracks were still there, circling the camp before disappearing into the distance. Mark and Tom were gone. Their tent was empty, their gear untouched. No footprints led away from the camp. No sign of a struggle, just the same claw-like tracks that had haunted me the night before. "We have to find them," Ryan said, his voice trembling. We spent the day searching, our calls swallowed by the vast, icy silence. The tracks led us higher up the mountain, twisting and doubling back, as if taunting us. And then we found the beacon. It was Mark's GPS buried in the snow. The screen still glowed faintly, the signal pulsing in the cold. But there was no sign of him, no sign of Tom, just the endless white. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but I could feel their meaning in my bones. "Leave." Emily was the first to snap. She woke screaming, her eyes wide with terror. "They're in the snow," she sobbed. "I saw them. They're waiting." Ryan tried to calm her, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out his voice. The air in the tent grew colder, and I swear I saw shadows moving outside, dark shapes that flickered just beyond the light. By dawn, Emily was gone. Her tracks led away from the tent, straight toward the cliff's edge. We followed them, calling her name, but the snow gave way to jagged ice, and we knew we'd never find her. Ryan broke down then, sinking to his knees in the snow. "It's the mountain," he said, his voice hollow. "It's taken them." We were alone now, two specks on an infinite sea of ice. The mountain loomed above us, silent and indifferent, and the hum had returned, vibrating through the ground. That night, I woke to find Ryan standing at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness. "Ryan," I called, my voice shaking. He turned slowly, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were dark, empty, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. "They're here." Before I could stop him, he walked into the snow, disappearing into the shadows. I called after him, but the whispers drowned out my voice, growing louder and louder until I thought my head would split. I don't remember how I made it back to base camp. The search and rescue team found me 2 days later, frostbitten and delirious, muttering about shadows and whispers. They never found the others. I've told this story a few times, but no one believes me. They say it was the altitude, the cold, the isolation that I imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I heard. The mountain took them, just like it's taken so many before, and I can still hear it. Late at night, when the world is quiet, the hum, the whispers, calling me back. Denali doesn't let go. Story number 4. The Call of the Kushtaka. Alaska is a land of stories. Its mountains, rivers, and endless forests seem to hold 1,000 secrets, whispered on the wind. When I moved to the small coastal town of Hoona to take a teaching job, I thought those stories were just that. Stories, tales passed down by the Tlingit people, meant to warn travelers and children about the dangers of the wilderness. I didn't believe in Kushtaka, not at first. The town was as remote as they come. A cluster of cabins and fishing boats nestled between the mountains and the sea. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the locals were friendly enough, though they seemed wary of outsiders. My students told me stories about Kushtaka, laughing nervously as they described creatures that were part man, part otter, tricksters, they called them, who mimicked human voices to lure people into the woods. I smiled and nodded, treating their tales like folklore. But one boy, Daniel, didn't laugh. He sat at the back of the classroom, his eyes dark and serious. "They're real," he said one day, his voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle saw one. It almost got him." The other kids groaned, rolling their eyes, but Daniel just stared at me, unblinking. "Don't go into the woods alone," he said. "They don't like it when you're alone." I thought about Daniel's warning a few days later as I hiked along the shore. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect blue, and I felt miles away from the stress of my old life. I'd been in Hoona for 3 weeks, and the wilderness was finally starting to feel like home. The trail I followed was overgrown, winding through the dense trees before opening onto a rocky beach. I stopped to rest, letting the sound of the waves wash over me. That's when I heard it. A cry, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing against the cliffs. The cry came again, closer this time. It sounded like a woman, her voice sharp with fear. I scrambled over the rocks, heading toward the sound. My heart pounded as I called out, but the only response was the wind and the waves. And then, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the trees, her back to me. She was dressed in a simple coat, her hair long and dark, but something about her seemed off. Her shoulders were too broad, her stance too stiff, and when she turned to face me, I froze. Her eyes were black, not dark, not shadowed, pure, gleaming black, like polished stones. Her lips curved into a smile that was too wide, her teeth sharp and glistening. And then she laughed. It wasn't a human sound. It was high-pitched, chittering, like the cry of an animal. She turned and darted into the trees, moving with impossible speed. I didn't follow. I ran. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light or a prank by some local kids. But the image of her stayed with me, those black eyes, that inhuman laugh. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lured, that she'd been waiting for me. Daniel noticed my unease the next day. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked after class. I didn't answer. "You need to leave an offering," he said, his voice urgent. "They get angry if you don't. Tobacco, something shiny. You have to show respect." I wanted to dismiss him, but his words clung to me. That evening, I left a small pouch of tobacco on the beach where I'd seen her. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the forest was watching me. When I returned the next morning, the pouch was gone, but the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmuring at the edge of my hearing. I'd hear them in the classroom, on the trail, even in my cabin at night. They grew louder as the days passed, turning into voices I recognized: my mother, my brother, even my own voice, calling my name. "Come outside," they whispered. "We need you." One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and scanned the trees. The whispers stopped, replaced by the sound of something moving, branches snapping, leaves rustling. My beam caught a pair of eyes, low to the ground, glinting in the darkness. It was an otter, its sleek body half hidden in the undergrowth. But as I stared, it rose onto its hind legs, its shape twisting and stretching into something human. Its fur melted away, revealing pale skin and long limbs. And its face, it was her, the same woman I'd seen on the beach, her black eyes gleaming with malice. She smiled again, and this time, I saw her teeth rows of jagged, needle-like points. "Come with us," she said, her voice a raspy echo of my own. I ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the cabin itself was alive with their voices. I left Huna the next day, packed what little I could carry, and caught the first ferry back to Juneau. The locals didn't ask why I was leaving, but their silence spoke volumes. Daniel was the only one who said goodbye. "Don't talk about them," he warned as I boarded the ferry. "They don't like being remembered." I haven't gone back, but the Kushtaka haven't left me. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, and in my dreams, I see her standing at the edge of the trees, smiling with those sharp, glistening teeth, waiting. Story number 5. Vanished over the Triangle. The Alaskan wilderness is a place of unforgiving beauty, vast, endless, and ancient. It's the kind of land that reminds you how small and fragile you are. I never gave much thought to the stories about the Alaska Triangle, the region stretching between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow until I got the call. I was a freelance journalist in Anchorage at the time, chasing stories no one else wanted. When I heard about the disappearance of Congressman Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, and their companions in 1972, it sounded like just another tragic accident in a place infamous for swallowing planes. But the longer I dug, the stranger the story became. The official line was simple. A Cessna 310 vanished mid-flight between Anchorage and Juneau, despite one of the largest search and rescue operations in U.S. history, involving dozens of planes and thousands of searchers. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies, no debris, nothing. But the locals had other ideas. They're still out there. An old bush pilot named Sam told me one night at a dive bar in Fairbanks. His voice was low, his eyes distant. "Not alive, of course. But the triangle doesn't let go. Not completely." I laughed, assuming he was drunk. But his expression didn't waver. "You'll see," he said. "If you go looking, you'll see." I didn't set out to find the plane. I just wanted to write a story, something to capture the eerie mystery of it all. But as the weeks turned into months, the story took over my life. I interviewed pilots who swore they'd seen strange lights in the triangle, hunters who claimed they'd found footprints too large to be human. One man even told me he'd seen a plane, half buried in the tundra, only to find it gone when he returned with help. By December, I was obsessed. And that's how I ended up chartering a plane to retrace the Cessna's flight path. The pilot, Joe, was a wiry man with a sharp tongue and a deep respect for the triangle. "We'll go as far as weather allows," he said as we boarded the small plane. But if things get weird, we turn back. Understood. I nodded, though I didn't believe him. What could be weirder than a plane vanishing without a trace? The first hour of the flight was uneventful. The sky was clear, the mountains below glittering with fresh snow. Joe kept the chatter light, pointing out landmarks and telling me about his years flying in the bush. Then the radio cut out. Joe frowned, fiddling with the dials. "It's probably just the terrain," he muttered, though his hands were trembling. "Happens all the time out here." But the static didn't sound normal. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something was trying to break through. I leaned closer, and for a moment, I thought I heard a voice, faint and distorted, but unmistakably human. "Help us!" Joe must have heard it too, because he cursed under his breath and yanked the controls. "We're turning back." I didn't argue. The air had grown heavy, oppressive, as if the sky itself was pressing down on us. Clouds rolled in from nowhere, dark and roiling, and the plane began to shake. "Hold on!" Joe shouted as the turbulence threw us against our seats. The clouds swallowed us whole, and the world outside the windows turned an unbroken gray. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped. When the clouds cleared, we weren't where we were supposed to be. The mountains were gone, replaced by endless tundra that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow. But something about the light was wrong, too harsh, too cold. "Where the hell are we?" Joe whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I was staring at something in the distance, a dark shape jutting out of the snow, the wreckage of a plane. Joe landed the plane without a word, his hands white-knuckled on the controls. As soon as we touched down, I grabbed my gear and ran toward the wreck. It was an old Cessna, its fuselage crumpled and wings twisted. The metal was rusted, the paint faded, but the tail number was still visible. It matched the missing plane. The air was eerily still as we approached the wreck. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of our boots in the snow. Joe stayed by the plane, muttering prayers under his breath, while I climbed into the cockpit. The seats were empty, but there were signs of life, scattered belongings. A torn jacket, a thermos tipped on its side. I found a notebook wedged under one of the seats, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was frantic, the words scrawled in uneven lines. "We're not alone." I flipped through the pages, my breath catching at the final entry. It wasn't written in ink. It was scratched into the paper, the letters jagged and desperate. "They're coming." A shadow fell over me, and I turned, expecting to see Joe. But the figure in the doorway wasn't him. It was a man, tall and thin, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were sunken, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He wore a suit, tattered and stained, and his lips moved soundlessly as he stared at me. "Joe!" I screamed, scrambling out of the cockpit. The figure didn't move, didn't follow, but his empty gaze burned into me as I ran back to the plane. Joe was gone. I don't remember much after that, just fragments, the sound of whispers, soft and relentless, calling my name, the feeling of hands brushing against my arms, pulling me back toward the wreck, the cold, sinking into my skin, my bones, my soul. I woke up in a hospital bed 2 days later. A search and rescue team had found me wandering the tundra, delirious and frostbitten. They never found Joe, or the wreck, or any trace of what I'd seen. I left Alaska after that, gave up journalism, moved to a city where the streets are too noisy to hear the whispers. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them anyway, and I know the triangle hasn't let me go.